Hello, my name is Laura Campbell. My student number is N99561558. My tutor is Jennifer Clifton, and I was in the Monday 2 to 3 p.m. lecture, and I will be discussing how my placement went and how I was able to successfully teach my minor of mathematics in the classroom. The school in which my placement was completed was situated in a high socioeconomic area. The school was attended by approximately 600 students, and within the Year 2 class student that I was placed in, there were 24 students with mixed levels of abilities, as well as 4 students with learning difficulties and 4 more students who needed literacy and numeracy support. In this classroom, there were multiple teachers that came in the classroom for extra support, which I was ensured to utilize. The age range was from 6 to 7 years old. The classroom was an iPad room where all of the students had their own personal device, which was used in the majority of lessons. The focus of my data was on mathematics, in particular three-dimensional shapes. The curriculum link obtained from the Australian curriculum Year 2 Mathematics, Measurement and Geography in the shape section was students are able to describe the features of three-dimensional shapes. The key learning intention during this mathematical unit was for the students to be able to name 3D shapes and identify their features such as faces, edges, and corners. At the start of this unit, I've created a diagnostic assessment piece, which was based on the final summative assessment. The purpose of the diagnostic assessment is to measure the student's current knowledge and give an indication of where the students are at this moment. This assisted me in identifying my higher level and lower level learners, as then I can ensure to keep them all involved and engaged through differentiation. In conjunction to this, looking at the Year 1 success criteria, it is assumed that the students already have some knowledge of three-dimensional shapes and their features. With this in mind, I kept the assessment piece concise with only 4 questions where the students would have to name the shape, name how many sides and corners and edges it had. This was given to the students a week prior to their learning of 3D shapes had commenced. These sheets were gathered and marked and were used to identify what the students already know about the names and features and what common misconceptions they have. These sheets were analysed and the data was collected through an Excel spreadsheet as shown. The colour depends on what mark the students got out of 4. Red shows 0 mark correct, orange shows 1, yellow shows 2 correct, blue shows 3 correct, and green demonstrates that they got all 3 features and the shape name correct. From this data, I was able to gather that most students struggle with edges and corners, and from there I was able to focus on these aspects and ensuring that students knew the differentiation between the two. With this data, I also was able to create 4 groups based on ability level and create focus area and goals for these groups. When looking at student F's work, they did not know the 3-dimensional names for the shapes, and they used the 2-dimensional names such as square and rectangle. Whereas student P, which sits on here, was able to identify the names of the shapes, but had some struggle with the corners and edges, especially with the cone. Student P expressed confusion with the meaning of faces, edges, and corners per person. Student P was also used as a peer helper for student F due to their comparison in knowledge and ability to peer teach and help each other. With this data, I created my first lesson. In this, I had the students identify different 3D shapes and compare them to real-life objects, such as the shape of a shoebox is a rectangular prism. We then worked through an activity where all the students worked together to count each of the edges, corners, and faces of each of the shapes. The students worked as a class and counted together, as well as then the students who were struggling can listen to everyone else. After introducing the students to these shapes, which were a rectangular prism, sphere, cylinder, cone, and pyramid, the students were able to add these shapes to their shape notebook on their iPad, which I had created with them for a previous lesson, which allowed them to look over at home and with their parents. The students were then moved on to using a hands-on method of learning, and we used Play-Doh to create the shapes that we had just learnt about. After creating the shapes, the students were able to point out the faces, edges, and corners. This would assist them in visually learning the difference, especially focusing on edges and corners, as this was a target difficulty in our first collection of data. I gave the students feedback on how to create these shapes and had myself and the assistant teacher assure that they were correct when pointing to the different features. The students moved on from working together to completing this activity. The students were asked to name each of the 3D shapes, and they were using real objects, as the students had shown their understanding of how objects around us have shape names, such as their water bottle was a cylinder. Students were able to verbally discuss what objects were a rectangular prism. For example, they were pointed to the tissue box or they pointed to the bookshelf. With some students getting still mixed up with writing the 2D shape names instead of 3D names, I thought this activity would be beneficial as they can see that it is not just the shape but an object. This rote learning activity can be adapted for the students to use their iPads to write their names and also type the name of the shape. In comparing my data from student F and student P, student F was still focusing on the 2D shape names such as rectangle and circle instead of their 3D name. This was quickly brought to my attention as I was marking, and I was able to take the student aside very quickly and discuss their results with them. After a conversation, they were able to verbally point to the shapes, and such as say F, the ball, is not a circle, but it is a sphere because it is three-dimensional, not two-dimensional. Student P, on the other hand, was able to correctly identify all the shapes and names with ears. They used correct spelling and finished very quickly. So I moved them on to giving them a new task of assisting the students around them if they were struggling at all. And I used this data to change my next lesson plan to create smaller groups in their learning levels. So I would be able to have specific focus on my lower level learners and extend the learning of my higher level learners. The students used this small group time to hold the different shapes and ensure that they were placing it in their palm to count all the features so they would not be wobbling it around and losing track of what they had already counted. Each of the students had their own set of shapes. So I was able to test their prior knowledge of the shape names by telling them to grab, say, a cylinder and giving hints when they were sure. I was able to utilize my teacher aids in the room as this allowed there to be more individualized focus on the areas of struggle. After the students named and identified the features of all the shapes, if they were feeling confident, we placed it in a bag and had a mystery bag activity where it was a student-led activity where the students would pick a shape out of the bag and describe the different features, and the other students would have to guess if they were looking at the right shape or not. The final formative assessment task was the exam, where prior to starting the exam, I had all the students sit down together and we went through the beginning PowerPoint where we were talking about the shapes and the different edges and corners and faces, and we had a really quick plowback about all this information. After this, the students were feeling confident with each of their shapes names and they were able to complete the test. The test consisted of naming shapes, how many faces, edges, and corners there were. The students only had to complete 3 of the shapes, but could do all of them if they would like. All of the students had a go at completing all the details for each of the shapes. The overall class data showed improvement. The question 2 was describing the features of the sphere, and which the students excelled in. As you can see, there's a lot of green, which means they got all 4 marks for that one. Although a few students were still calling it a circle and said that there were no faces as they were confused because the curved face was curved. And question 5 was probably the one that they had most difficulty with, where they were describing the cone, where they were describing the apex as a corner, as well as identifying it only having one face and not counting the curved face once again. Although there was a drastic improvement in results from the diagnostic assessment to their final assessment, the students as well only had to give details of 3 of the shapes, but did attempt all of the shapes as they wanted to complete all of the shapes and show their knowledge. Student F showed great improvement in their knowledge of shape names as well as identifying and counting corners correctly. They were also able to give identifying features of each of the shapes, such as naming that they have 2D shapes, such as the pyramid has a square bottom, or the cone has a circle base. And student P was able to correctly spell and name all of the shapes, as well as confidently count the features. They also provided extra information, such as how shapes are made up of faces that are 2D shapes, such as a cube is made up of squares, and that there is a square-based pyramid, which is above and beyond what we were expecting from them. As seen with student F, in their diagnostic assessment, they were not able to answer any of the questions or correctly, but in their formative assessment, they were able to answer at least one of every single feature of each of the shapes. And student P, although their results originally were quite high, they were able to show improvement across the board with getting every single answer correctly. This has increased achievement in both of these students. For future professional experience, the improvements that can be made through spending an extra day on these tasks. Unfortunately, this was not available due to public holidays and catching up from the previous term where COVID stopped lessons. In the future, I would have spent this extra time doing more diverse tasks with the students, such as a shape plan around the classroom. Activities such as this would have benefited to track the students' progress. The repetition would have been beneficial as rote learning gives the students time to retain information and give them confidence in what they have learned. Although this unit was to start developing these skills, it would have been enjoyable to spend more time for the lower level learners. Giving more time for peer teaching ensures that all students are engaged, as well as utilizing my resources and data that had been collected to ensure that I had gathered enough information to have a better understanding of how the students are progressing. These are my references. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate your time.